Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. On behalf of the Euromed Human Rights Monitor, based in Geneva, with headquarters in Geneva, I welcome you today. I welcome our distinguished speakers. I also welcome our audience following us on all our platforms. We're all gathered here today to discuss 8 decades of Israel policies, practices, and aggression against Palestine, its livelihood, and its people. We're here to see in the coming war and a half how it is possible that Israel has had absolute impunity for 8 decades while violating on a daily basis almost international law and commitments. So entering into more specific details of the talk today, of the webinar, this webinar comes at a critical time for Palestinians all over historical Palestine. There are the Palestinians that are being repeatedly slaughtered in the Gaza Strip while being trapped inside a besieged, Israeli man-made enclave for almost 2 decades now. A place that has been labeled as unlivable by 2020 by the UN. Then there is the Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem who are living under an Israeli system that has been defined as apartheid by numerous international human rights organizations, a system where it is clear that Palestinian rights are severely and bluntly restricted compared to their Israeli occupiers, whether it is through the extrajudicial execution across the West Bank, the storming of the refugee camp every other morning, followed by indiscriminate and arbitrary arrests, the storming of human rights organizations, the killing of journalists such as Shireen Abu Akleh, forced displacement all over the West Bank and Jerusalem, home demolitions, settlement construction and expansion, and settler violence. The violations are numerous. They happen every day. In short, Israel is violating its obligations as an occupying power in the OPT and showing complete disregard for a rule-based order. With every passing day, Israel continues to violate those rights, the rights of Palestinian men, women, children, and elderly, and break international law without being held to any form of accountability. The continued occupation by Israel of Palestinian territory and discrimination against Palestinians are the key root causes of the recurrent tensions and also, but more so, the instability not only in Palestine, but in the entire region. These are not my words. These are the words of the first report issued by the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the OPTs, including East Jerusalem and Israel, 2 months ago. So what Israel is doing is destabilizing the entire region. This is a conclusion coming out of a UN report. But this is not the first time a UN report comes out accusing Israel of violating Palestinians. These reports are abundant. In 2020 only, the UN General Assembly adopted 17 resolutions on Palestinian rights. But none of these reports, none of these resolutions lead to something. They have shown little or no use in terms of deterring Israel from continuing or even exasperating the attacks on Palestinians and the blatant, human rights violations that I have just summed up. In short, or therefore, in this webinar today, for the audience watching us, we are hosting leading human rights defenders, some of whom are affiliated to the United Nations and who have been working intensely and extensively on the human rights violation in Palestine. Those experts are with us today to discuss with us and to explain to us and to the audience how it is, and how come, and why Israel has been flouting international law and evading accountability despite its long record of violations and abuses against Palestinians. We would like to hear from you about the mechanisms that are put in motion or that are being retrained. We would like to understand how this kind of freeze on holding Israel accountable takes place. And we would also like to discuss whether is it possible to challenge this impunity? Is there possible to see some change taking place in the near future? For our audience, before I give the torch, pass the torch to the speakers, if you have any questions or comments during the discussion, please write them down in the comment section of the live feed, and our team will be monitoring them, and I will be able to post and send those questions to our speakers. The webinar will last for 90 minutes, and we will start with Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who is Palestinian himself. He's a Palestinian author. He's the editor-in-chief of the Palestine Chronicle. Ramzy will kindly provide us with an overview of the latest developments on the ground in Palestine, as he has been covering and writing about Israel's human rights violations for the past 25 years. We look forward to hearing from you, Ramzy. What has happened recently? How do you believe? Is this an addition, an accumulation? Is this a policy that has always been in place? Is it worse than before? So please, I hand you over the mic.
Thank you very much, Haneen, and thanks to the Euromed Monitor for the fantastic work that it continues to do. Before I touch on the issue that you highlighted, I want to just provide a little bit of context about myself and how all of this is somehow linked to my upbringing and my childhood. I grew up in the Gaza Strip. I grew up in a refugee camp called Nusayrat, one of the most targeted refugee camps in the successive Israeli wars on the Gaza Strip. Not just starting 2008-9, as the media often would love to provide that as the only context relevant to Gaza, but since the very, very beginning, meaning the following the Palestinian dispossession, the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, and the immediate aftermath when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees. Nearly over 200,000 of them became refugees in the Gaza Strip, and that's where my parents were expelled, and that's where I was born, in the Nusayrat refugee camp. I grew up in this environment in which we're always puzzled, constantly puzzled by the fact that the so-called international community has failed to do anything about the situation, our situation in the refugee camp. We reached a point of total desperation that when we see any European, any Westerner, any white, anybody, whether a UN worker, a journalist, a tourist, passing by the refugee camp or in the streets of our refugee camp, we would immediately go chasing after him or her. And the elders in the neighborhood will always, kind of count on us, the youngsters who spoke a little bit of English, and say, tell them what's happening to us, so that they will tell the world, and so forth and so on. That statement always kind of comes back to my mind now whenever Israel attacks Gaza, and I see people in the news in Nusayrat, in Shati refugee camp, in Khan Yunis, anywhere else in Palestine, where people are still believing that if we tell them the truth, if we convey our truth and our reality to the world, things are going to be okay, because there is such a thing as a moral conscience, and that moral conscience will eventually be receptive to the Palestinian narrative. Sadly, when I moved to the US and lived outside Palestine for many years, I realized that this is not, that's not entirely true. It's not just the matter of telling them our truth and then the world is going to come to the side of the Palestinians and they were going to hold Israel accountable to international law, to humanitarian law, and so forth and so on. It's not so simple as that. And now I'm going to go back to what I was supposed to talk about, which is the latest Israeli war on Gaza of August 5th and the repercussions of this war. Now, every single war, when Israel attacks Gaza, there is always this context, this biased context provided by international media, by Western media, by corporate media, that tries to kind of cut Israel some slacks, if you will, provide a little bit of justification, rational, moral, political justification of why Israel has to do what it does to the Palestinians. Because the Palestinians ultimately are the bad guys. They have such ominous names for their resistance groups, Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and we all know the legacy of the war on terror, and we all know the existing biases and moral blind spots that the West has towards Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians in particular. And therefore, Israel is allowed to get away with so much as far as its mistreatment to Palestinians. But this time around, it was different because there was really no pretense whatsoever. The Palestinians did not fire a single rocket on Israel for a long time, in fact. There were no attempts at penetrate the border or the fence separating besieged Gaza from Israel. There were no Israeli-Palestinian attacks of any kind that could be explained or rationalized as the pretext or the pretense or the context in which Israel, went and killed 49 Palestinians, including 17 children, wounded over 350, and bombed over 150 different targets, including civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. Yet somehow, and I'm not even referring to Joe Biden and Israel's right to exist, to defend itself, and Olaf Scholz or any other European and Western leaders, this kind of knee-jerk reaction to whatever Israel does to the Palestinians. I'm talking about the media. I'm talking about the New York Times. I'm talking about the BBC. I am talking about this media that's quite often celebrated in the West as liberal, as journals of records, as neutral parties in all of this. Yet if you read the media coverage of what has taken place in Gaza, you would really get the impression that Israel was forced to do what it did out of sheer necessity, that the term Israeli security here is absolutely essential to this discussion. And at best, if that wasn't the case, at best, or rather at worst, Israel and the Palestinians are caught in another flare-up of violence. But no fingers were pointed at the fact that Israel actually has carried out what can only be described as an unprovoked aggression against the Palestinians. Sadly, even some in the Middle Eastern media that take their news from Western news agencies kind of repeated these lines and made references to the Palestinian militants and of the Islamic Jihad and so forth and so on. But of course, this is not the way that this so-called conflict should have been portrayed. The media has constantly provided the wrong context. If you go to the Wikipedia page on Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip, you will always start with the beginning of the story, 2006, when Hamas was elected by the Palestinians during the legislative elections in 2006, and that led to the civil unrest between the Hamas and Fatah movements, and that forced Israel's hands to do what it has to do to control, to protect the security of its residents and civilians and the inhabitants of southern Israel. But of course, again, this is not just bias, it's outright wrong, it's deceptive context. Palestinians are in constant state of self-defense because Palestinians are living under an Israeli military occupation. And when you live under a military occupation of any kind, especially for this long, you are allowed under international law, you are permitted to at least be given the dignity of being the party in a state of self-defense. Look at the situation in Ukraine right now. Is there one single American, Western newspaper, news agency, mainstream media platform that would agree that, well, you see, the situation is far more complex to accuse Russia of being an occupying party, or to use such terms as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That wouldn't even be entertained for a second. In the case of the Palestinians and Israel, 75 years after the ethnic cleansing of historic Palestine, over 55 years after the Israeli occupation of Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and we are still fighting as Palestinians against the Western media, trying to impose our, not just impose our narrative, but desperately trying to actually show that there is indeed such a Palestinian viewpoint that should be taken serious, despite the fact that this Palestinian viewpoint is fully backed by international law and fully backed by the international community, save the United States and few of its allies and friends. So this is now back to my original point, and I'm gonna try not to exceed my 15 minutes here. Back to my original point, this idea of, if you tell the world the truth, the world is gonna come to your rescue. Okay, so this ended up being not entirely true, because whether the world knows or doesn't, the truth will always be hidden to protect Israel. Joe Biden knows very well that Israel is not in a state of self-defense. Western leaders understand that fully. They really do. But political expediency is forcing them to think and articulate a different political discourse. What do we do now as Palestinians when we are caught in this impossible paradigm? When we are trying to communicate a message, a narrative, convey a story that nobody wants to listen to. Yet at the same time, we would try to provide other means of communicating our message, other means of resistance, call it peaceful resistance, call it unarmed resistance, or whatever, including the BDS movement, the boycott movement of Israel. Even then, we are accused of being anti-Semitic. Even then, we are accused of somehow concocting this plot to erase Israel off the face of the earth. And even then, we are still the bad guys in this relationship. So I'm going to leave it at this, and I'm hoping that perhaps we can, within this webinar, in future discussions, maybe we can talk about how do we resolve this impossible dilemma that we are caught in. Regardless of what form of resistance we are using, we will always be portrayed as the bad guys, and Israel will always be portrayed as a state that is in self-defense. Yet at the same time, we are the occupied party. We are those who are subjected to a system of racism and apartheid, and we are, in fact, the ones who are going through this constant state of self-defense, and where our security and our rights are in any way protected. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope I did not exceed my allocated time.
You did not. Thank you so much, Ramzy. You have actually mastered so well putting into words the emotions of every, if I can say so myself, every single Palestinian. This has always been a question. I think it's one of us has always wondered about, why is it so that no one is understanding our fears and our emotion as equally human as those of the Israelis that are occupying us. So thank you for your words. Thank you for putting them. Actually, thank you for your emotions, because you've been really able to express what I feel, what many of us feel. Something that I would also like to tackle that you have mentioned, and I hope that our next speaker, which I will introduce in a bit, Francesca, will be able to also maybe incorporate in your discussion, is that Ramzy said that he believed that the moral consciousness of the world will acknowledge the truth once we tell that truth, once they start seeing it, once it's out there that we are not lying or faking it or whatsoever. Today, social platforms have allowed for this truth to come out, less so than before, during, I think, when both Ramzy and I grew up, the first and the second Intifada. Today, the eyes of the West are on the field. There's no more hiding. So what is going on with that moral consciousness? This is, and the UN represents, is supposed, has been created to represent and be that moral voice of the planet, of the globe. This question will go, please, all three UN representatives here with us, former also UN Rapporteur Richard Falk will join us later in. I will repeat the question also for him. So please now allow me to give the word to Francesca Albanese. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian territories. Before being trapped in this position, between brackets, she and still is a prominent lawyer and the author of various publications on the question of Palestinian refugees and other research publications. We are very curious, let's say, as people outside of the UN body, to first of all understand what it is, in a very basic introduction, to tell us what is it that a UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine is supposed to do, if you can inform our audience on the basics of your job. And then please, let's tackle the subject of this webinar, which is, how do we hold Israel accountable? Do we hold Israel accountable? Will Israel ever be held accountable? So I give the word to you. Thank you, Francesca, for being with us.
Thank you, Hanin, and thank you, Robert, for organizing this event and inviting me. Yeah, I took office as a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, on the occupied territory since 1967, 3 months and a half ago. And I have enough to say that, yes, I'm trapped in this for the next 6 years. As any special rapporteur, there are 55 of us, so 55 independent experts as individual or collegial bodies, investigating, monitoring, and reporting to the Human Rights Council, and some of us also to the General Assembly about specific situations. Most mandate holders are report on thematic issues like the right to food or the right to water or countering terrorism, human rights defenders. And then there are also 10 mandate holders, 10 rapporteurs who specifically report on given country situations. And so my mandate is one of those. It's an unpaid position of the UN. In fact, it's a voluntary position offered on the ground of expertise and particular knowledge of the situation on the ground or the legal situation on the ground. And so we are not UN officials. I mean, of course, I'm bound by UN rules and regulations in my speech, in my dealing, but I'm not a UN official. Voila. And I'm glad that there is a Richard Falk who was a special rapporteur before Michael Lincoln with Dishonor. So I'm proud to follow in many respects his steps. Now I would like to add to start with one comment which goes directly into what Hanin asked me in relation to Ramzy's feeling of the reality on the ground in need to be recognized for what it is. I've often discussed and written about the epistemic violence that characterizes the way Palestine is portrayed, is narrated in the media, but also in the political discourse. And Gaza offers an important case in point. And when I say epistemic violence, is the denial of the inherent denial of the human rights situation suffered by the Palestinians, and the denial of the broader context, that there is an exasperation of the attention on specific violations committed by Israel, because it's not that it's not reported or not known, but the broader context is often lacking. And I do see that there is a new tendency right now to look at the broader context, and the merit goes to the Palestinians, also to some Israeli civil society organizations, and also to some instances in the UN who have pointed at the broader context of widespread and systemic illegality of Israeli policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, naming the apartheid. Although the apartheid discourse suffers from some limitations, it's very important to start looking at the broader picture. And although the international community has still to process and act upon the crime of apartheid and the huge implications it has from a legal point of view, at the same time, this is shifting slowly, but it's shifting the way Palestine is and the Palestinians are looked at. Now, let me go to Gaza and to add a legal reading to what Ramzy reported. Because there is this problem of qualification and depiction of the reality on the ground, as soon as the attack, the last offensive commenced, I looked at the situation, and based on my analysis, it was very clear that was an act of aggression and violated Israel's assault was an act of aggression, violating the integrity of the occupied Palestinian territory and besieged Gaza in particular. It was a very heavy statement, and it took many by surprise. There was attacked. I was criticized for being so blunt, but this is what it is. And I argued on the ground of international law. Look, this is the law of war, the law of use of force is very clear. The use of force is only permitted in two circumstances: whether when it's authorized by the UN Security Council, and this was not the case, or when it's in self-defense, so when it's in response to an attack. Now, I know that Israel uses self-defense, including to justify its assault, but it's a concept of preemptive self-defense, which has no legal grounding and doesn't exist in international law. The fact that it has been used occasionally doesn't make it a norm of international law. The norm remains grounded on Article 42 of the UN Charter, or Article 51 of the UN Charter, and this is why whatever is not within these margins, it's a violation of the UN Charter, and it's an act of aggression. It's an abusive use of force. Voilà. And I also said, in fact, that the legality of that assault went beyond the fact that it was an act of aggression, because it also, Israel still is an occupying power. Israel is still an occupying power of Gaza, although it doesn't have boots on the ground. So even if PIJ, even if the Palestinian Islamic Jihad represents a threat, any measures taken by Israel to restore order and security must take into account the security and the wellness of the people in Gaza, of the people under occupation, or of the occupied population. So the assault itself was also indiscriminate, disproportionate, and again, not necessary, because it was not provoked. As Ramzy was saying, there was no justification whatsoever. So what is the international law, or what is the response that the international community should give? There are measures. I mean, there is no deficiency of solutions offered by international law in terms of measures that can be taken to respond to this situation, and it includes diplomatic, political, and economic measures, to say the least. The point is, though, that as my friend and legal scholar Ardeen said, international law is as strong as the willingness of state to ensure its universal application in similar situations. So Ramzy again is right when he says, but look at the situation in Ukraine, Russia versus Ukraine. There has been a prompt reaction, a proper initial, a proper reading of what was happening, an act of aggression, an unlawful invasion, and a right of self-defense of the Ukrainian population. This has not been applied as of yet to Palestine, to the Palestinian people. And as a special rapporteur, I think it's also my role and responsibility to call out these misrepresentations and to recall not only the importance of a legal analysis, which includes the broader context, but also what are the measures that international community must take to restore international law, which includes justice, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. And I would like to conclude with one point, going to the broader context and then expanding the discussion to the rest of the occupied territory from the western region, which is the Gaza Strip, because this is another problem, that the fragmentation has grown so entrenched that we approach the Gaza as a standalone entity, and so the West Bank and so is Jerusalem. No, this is part of the same territory which remains occupied and which remains of what was once historical Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, in which the State of Israel was created. So what remains of this territory is constitutes an unicum and is to be treated as such. So what happens to Gaza has an impact to the whole occupied Palestinian territory, to the whole occupied Palestinian population. And when it comes to the broader context, I cannot think of one concept, of one right, which has been really like the elephant in the room, probably the most misunderstood, the right of all, which is the right of self-determination. The Palestinians, as a people, have a right of self-determination, which includes freedom within the territory that remains of their ancestral homeland, which is 22% of what constituted Palestine. So Gaza under blockade and under collective punishment, which is in itself a war crime, and in itself reflects the self-defense, the preemptive self-defense policy that Israel deploys vis-à-vis Gaza. So the principle of self-determination means that the occupation itself has no raison d'etre. It's illegal because after 55 years, an occupation which is not of temporary nature, which translates into the repression and suppression of the occupied population, which has been a vehicle to annex occupied territory, which is in itself a violation of a peremptory norm of international law, which permits no derogation. So the occupation should be challenged as such. And I'm puzzled to see the international community dealing with Israel as if it was a good faith occupier at best, which has proven, it has proven extensively not to be. And so I think a paradigm shift is needed. An international community must question what it takes to realize the Palestinians' right to self-determination. It cannot be the outcome of the negotiation between the occupied and the occupier. It must be a precondition for negotiation and for peace. And I truly hope not to have passed my time.
That's all. Thank you very much, Francesca. I have to say, also you bring up many, many questions. I have written a few myself for the Q&A later on. But I would just like to sum up a little of what you said in my own words. Basically, Israel clearly has no intention of ending the occupation. This is what you see on the ground. This is what we've seen through the several attacks. That intention, that willingness, that goodwill is not there. This is what the UN reports, yours and others, I think, mention in, let's say, big lines. In fact, today Israel has established clear policies to ensure complete permanent control over the OPTs. This includes altering the demography of these territories through the maintenance of a repressive environment for Palestinians and also a more favorable environment for Israeli settlers, is today playing demographically with the geography in order to render any form of Palestinian self-determination or Palestinian state impossible. It is also within these realities on the ground, this population shifts and transfers, that I think the UN should come to a conclusion that maybe Palestinian self-determination is no longer a possibility, given the major alterations that Israel has enforced on the grounds when it comes to the basics of land and people. With this in mind, I will go to our next speaker, if you allow me. We have with us today, very happily, James Heenan. He's the head of the UN Human Rights Office in the occupied Palestinian territories. James has been in the office working with the Human Rights Office for, if I'm not mistaken, nearly 15 years. You are yourself also a lawyer. Your background is in law. And we're very happy that you are here with us today to address. You also are on the ground. You follow all of these concerns. You see those violations on the ground. You're here today to address these questions that we have tackled, that Francesca has mentioned, that Ramzy has framed. Today, the question that everyone, I believe, has in the audience is, what is the UN's role in bringing human rights abusers to account? What can you do to hold whether it's in Palestine or somewhere else in another country, how do you bring human rights abusers to account? What are the barriers and obstacles that you are facing as the head of the Human Rights Office, UN Human Rights Office in the OPTs? And could you maybe give us a roadmap to justice, if possible? It's a big question, but you never know. Thank you.
Thanks, Haneen, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone. Thanks for inviting me and to Euromed for organising this webinar. Yeah, I mean, the questions we're dealing with encompass a lot, and Ramzy has certainly put forward in a very compelling way the impact of this occupation on Palestinians. I think at least all of us on the panel and many listening in will know quite a lot about the impact, the daily impact on people. I guess the issue, as Haneen said, is looking forward. And what's new? What can we do that's new? Because after so many decades, some days it feels like everything has been tried and not much works. I've worked in the OPT for 7 years, and I have to say that in those 7 years, the situation has degenerated. I work for the UN. Francesca also sort of works for, or she does work for the UN. She's just not paid for it, that's all. The UN has many different parts. It's essentially 3 parts. One is member states sitting around, like in the Security Council. Another part is people like me who work in the Secretariat. And then there's the independent part, which is Francesca and Professor Falk before, and the UN treaty bodies, and also the commissions of inquiry. What I'm talking about is what I do, or what we do in our office, and the perspectives we see. I guess the first point to make is that our number one issue, and when I say that, I mean it is the High Commissioner for Human Rights' number one issue in Palestine, is accountability. She has said this again and again and again. On the 11th of August, after the latest escalation in Gaza, she put out a fairly long public statement. But at the end, she said, and I'm quoting here, she said, an almost total lack of accountability persists in the occupied Palestinian territory, whether for violations of international humanitarian law by all parties and hostilities in Gaza, or for recurring Israeli violations of international human rights law and the law of occupation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, including incidents of unnecessary and disproportionate use of force. We what's our role in ensuring accountability rather than in just saying there has to be accountability? The first thing is that we are on the ground. I mean, I'm not on the ground, and I'll explain why not in a minute. But our office is on the ground collecting the information, and that is our mandate. And this ties into what what you said, Heenan, and also what Ramzy said. Our mandate really is to highlight what is going on the ground in the OPT. Now, I know the reactions of many in the international community might not be what we expect, but at least people can't say they didn't know. Now, I don't want to say it's just the UN doing this, because our fantastic partners in civil society are doing this as well. And this is where one of the first lessons come, is that those who are the eyes and ears on the ground, who are getting the information out, are currently under attack. So we know what's happening with our civil society partners in the West Bank. The 7 now organisations that have either been designated as terror organisations or declared unlawful. We know that the Human Rights Watch representative, a good friend Omar, has been removed from the country, and I'm not in the country. Israel has refused to renew my visa for 2 years, and not just my visa, but all of my 20 international staff have been out of the country for 2 years. We're still able to do our job because we have our national staff in the country. But my point is that this whole idea of getting the truth or getting the facts out there is still very much key to the issue of accountability. I think reports are important, and the reason why I think that is because when you see how much effort is made to try to undermine reports, you see how effective they are. People wouldn't make any effort to undermine them if they weren't effective. We also put out other issues, like, for example, we came out with our investigation on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh about 6 weeks ago. And we also do a number of other reports to the General Assembly of the Human Rights Council, as does the Special Rapporteur. What we have said in these reports is not just the systemic lack of accountability, but also how the climate of impunity fosters violations. If people aren't held to account, then they will continue to violate international law. Also, if there's no accountability, those who are calling for accountability can be targeted, and that's what I referred to before. I think those who call for accountability are targeted in the occupied Palestinian territory. For us, the 3 key issues that we have calling for accountability on: 1 are the violations committed in the scope of hostilities in Gaza in particular. The second is the unlawful, excessive or entirely unwarranted use of force in the West Bank. We saw 19 people injured with live ammunition in 1 day last week or the week before. I mean, phenomenal levels, which didn't make anywhere in the news. And also on the issue of ill treatment and torture. So where do we go from here? Our role is to get the facts on a global methodology. We use the same methodology in every country. We collect the facts, we analyze them, we have our legal capacity to analyze them, and we give them to the member states, and we also advocate around them. What happens then? I don't want to say it's all in the hands of member states, but a lot of what we're talking about is in the hands of member states. And it is like that because that's the system we have. That's also the situation under international law. So, for example, we all know about Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions about third state responsibility, which is a positive duty on states to reasonably do what is in their power to prevent ongoing violations of humanitarian law. I see this as becoming more and more relevant to the situation of Palestine as we move forward. What can third states do? There's a large array, what will I say, smorgasbord of means available to other states, and we've only seen a very small number of those used so far. States parties to the Geneva Conventions must also provide universal jurisdiction with national legislation for war crimes, which are defined as grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. That's something that the High Commissioner has also noted and could be explored further. There's also a very basic international law issue of state responsibility, where states have an obligation not to recognise as lawful a situation created by a serious breach of international law. Now, this might sound very esoteric and very technical, but I'm mentioning these things because my point is that our international law regime and the way our international structure is set up puts these issues squarely in the hands of member states. Member states cannot really act unless they have solid information. We know that, and I know that from my everyday. The states call me every day asking for our views or information on the facts and what's going on in the occupied territories. They need that factual basis to move forward, and that's what we are trying to do. One of the things we do, for example, is provide standardized figures on what we call fatalities during escalation. So, for example, when there are attacks in Gaza, it is the role of our office to not only track the number of people killed, but to do a status determination about whether those individuals are, well, how many civilians are killed, put it that way. So in the latest incidents that happened a few weeks ago, we had 49 people killed, and so far we have determined that at least 26 of those were civilians. That sort of information is crucial if you're going to start asking member states to do something about accountability. They need to know those sorts of figures. So the way forward, Heenan, you talked about a roadmap for the way forward. I think we've been talking roadmaps for many years in Israel-Palestine. I wouldn't presume to have the great new idea for how to move forward, but I would say that what we have been doing, and I mean all of us, is not worthless. I think that the situation would be much worse if we didn't have the sort of reporting and advocacy that has been going on to date. And again, as I said, the 7 NGOs in the West Bank would not be being attacked now if they weren't being effective in doing something. I would probably still be in Israel-Palestine if we weren't being effective. So what we've been doing so far shouldn't all be thrown out. It's not. That's my first point. The second point is that there are still many avenues to explore under international law, and many people like Francesca and Adi Imseis and others are exploring those areas, and that gives us at least some sort of legal roadmap. I also have to say that the Palestinians, including the Palestinian government, are quite effective at exploring those international legal avenues as well. But I would not suggest that accountability is around the corner. It is a longer-term project, and I have to say, I have to give my how shall I say? I have to give my salute to Palestinians for staying in this long term, because it's extremely frustrating work. That's all I'll say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. It's grim. It's true. But it's I do realize, and I think Palestinians do realize that mapping, documenting, reporting, all of these violations do account for something. They're not worthless, I think. But when you're on the receiving end of that violence, you experience it as a slow process. I think this is what it is. What is requested from Palestinian is basically some sort of generational patience, some sort of inborn belief that somehow this will lead to something, and not that we give up on that. I mean, I think Ramzy will agree with me that we sleep and wake up on that strong belief that that change will come. But it is very interesting to see how international law functions. And I think the last point, the second point you raised at the end, saying that there are still many avenues that have not yet fully been explored when it comes to international law, is a very interesting point, because maybe we can pass this torch to Professor Richard Falk, and together, maybe later during the Q&A, we could tell the audience more specifically what these avenues could be. I assume you are referring to the International Criminal Court and other instances as such, or maybe lobbying member states and all these forms of political pressure. Perhaps we go more into details in the Q&A. We have a bunch of questions coming in. But before that, last but definitely not least, Professor Richard Falk. I am proudly announcing him as the chair of the Board of Trustees of Euromed. We are very proud that you are part of our organization. I don't think we could have wished for someone better to guide us in our, not just in our country reports on Palestine, but you are also looking at our work globally in other countries. So we thank you for that. So Professor Richard Falk is a professor of international law at Princeton University. He's our chair of Board of Trustees. Of course, a veteran human rights defender, someone that has relentlessly and with so much power defended the rights of Palestinians. He's the former UN Special Rapporteur in the Palestinian territories, and one of the first calling out Israel for its apartheid policies against Palestinians. Today, you're here with us. We are wondering, the audience is really, I think, one of the many questions that we receive is, why is the international community so silent about Palestine? What makes Palestine so special for the world? Because had it not been special, maybe people would have intervened. What is it in forms of international law, but also from a political dimension, that makes Palestine so silenced for its call to equal human rights? Would like also to know what it is that what you deem possible for holding Israel accountable, or how to see, will there ever be a shift in Israel's lack of accountability? I give the microphone to you. I hope you can hear us properly, all of us, and welcome. You need to turn on your microphone. Your microphone is muted. Yes. I cannot hear you, Professor. I cannot. Can anyone hear Professor Falk? No. Ramzy, can you hear him? Sorry.
I can't, no, fortunately.
Maybe you log out and log in again. I think you have to unmute yourself. Maybe log out and log in again. I think this would be, and then click on the unmute microphone if you sign in and sign out again. Sign out and sign in again. Yes. He will be joining us in a minute. If you don't mind, I have received quite some questions from the audience. I'd like just to wait for Professor Falk to be back with us. Ramzy, I have a question for you. We want to hear from you on how Western media outlets, what do you think stands in the way of Western media outlets portraying Israeli violations as they are without sugarcoating them? And to what extent are they biased? Is the Western media complicit in these Israeli violations? This is a question that we have received.
Absolutely. I think they are very much complicit in Israel's violations. I don't think Israel's violations would have been sustainable if it were not for those who are defending them or presenting them in a way or twisting the facts concerning these violations to place Israel, which is a violator, human rights violators committing all sorts of war crimes on a daily basis, to present it to be rather the opposite. I know that Richard is back with us. You might want to.
No, please continue. I will. Yes.
So, and this is one of the misconceptions that, and I think us Palestinians, I mean, many of us are kind of have fallen into that trap of believing that it is the matter of maybe presenting the story in a different way, maybe changing the language in a more sensible way that could be more accommodating of the sensibilities of Western audiences and so forth and so on. But that proved to be untrue. That no matter what we do with the way we present our story, with the way we convey the information from our point of view to be more consistent with sensitivities and sensibilities of Western audiences, the story is still missing altogether, which tells us that the issue is really not with us and our narrative. The issue is with Western media. And I think, just to give a very quick clue of why I think this is the case, just the fact that when we refer to Western media as corporate media, I mean, corporate media exists to defend corporate interests, not the interest of ordinary people in the Gaza Strip. They don't count into the list of interest of how corporate media behaves, neither in the US nor in Britain nor anywhere else in the world. In fact, not just in the Western world, anywhere else in the world. Corporate media looks at financial interest, economic interest, and then they make their editorial decisions based on that. In his seminal book, Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky speaks and elaborates on this very issue of why there is this consistency between mainstream corporate thinking and that of the state. And there's obviously many strong connections that makes the narrative of the media more or less consistent with the wishes and the interests of the state. So we have to keep that in mind before we dedicate way too much efforts and energies trying to switch the narrative of mainstream media, while in actuality we should be dedicating much time and energy to developing alternative platforms to push and champion the Palestinian narrative without watering it down, without changing it, and really presenting it the way it should have been presented in the first place.
Just a question from my end regarding what you mentioned. Would you say that let's put it quote unquote ignorance, would it be from the reporters on the ground, or do you think that their own reporters are being censored by the editor-in-chief in their motherlands?
It is rather, sadly, it's the latter, not the former. And many Western journalists spoke about this. They speak about it sometimes publicly, sometimes privately, where, when they try to refer to Palestinians as such, the language is immediately changed or twisted or censored altogether. So there is a middleman that stands between those on the ground and those that ensure that the publication or the final outcome of that content does not make it to the intended audience. And that middleman is the censor. Now, sadly, that middleman doesn't just exist in CNN and New York Times and such. They also exist, sadly, in social media platforms, where Facebook now becomes the censor, where Twitter now becomes the censor. And that was really kind of our last hope. Social media was supposed to be to bring that paradigm shift as far as the Palestinian narrative is concerned. But now we have to work with these new censors who are telling us what is the language to use, what's the image to upload, and what is the video to share. And that kind of really takes us back to square one as far as presenting the story of Palestine in an honest and a candid way to the rest of the world.
I see. Thank you, Ramzy. I have also a question for you, James. This is from Philip. He's a lawyer that works at an international law firms in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Philip asks you, what legal barriers need to be adopted in order for accountability before a court becomes effective? And how do those legal changes come about? This is a lawyer based in Amsterdam, I believe. Makes a few visits to the ICC courts every now and then. Is the question clear, or
what legal barriers have to be overcome? Was that the question?
Need to be adopted in order for a form of accountability before a court. So for accountability within a court, inside of court, to become effective.
Well, I mean, when I was talking about the legal avenues, I mentioned 2 or 3 of them. One is they're not all necessarily legally based. One I mentioned was third state responsibility under the Geneva Conventions. Another one is the under the Geneva Conventions, the call for universal jurisdiction in national legislation for war crimes. And that are defined as grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. So, it depends on which jurisdiction you're talking about, whether the domestic legal order sets up barriers to those things. But as a matter of international law, it's relatively clear what states' obligations are when they sign on to the Geneva Conventions, particularly in terms of that universal jurisdiction. But we've seen people try different legal avenues for 20 years maybe. So there's quite a lot of, we're not starting from a standing start, as it were. There's quite a lot of experience built up in different jurisdictions around the world. And here I'm not just talking about Israel, Palestine. Also, I work for the UN. I'm talking about many other situations where there's long-standing impunity and where that has driven a desire for accountability outside the country. Because in many countries you have maybe the ability to render justice, but not the will to render justice. So it depends on the jurisdiction. Thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Richard, welcome back. Very happy to have you with us. I will give you directly the microphone, please.
Okay. First, my apologies for the technical difficulties at my end. And I want to say how proud I am that Euromed organized this webinar, and it's been an honor to be associated with them over the years. Euromed has done valuable work with very little resources. I think this topic of accountability is very problematic in international law and even within the UN framework, because one has to appreciate that the most dangerous countries in the world are given a right of exception in the UN Charter itself by way of the veto. They, in fact, can say whenever they wish to that international law is not applicable to our pursuit of a particular policy. And they also, and have done throughout the existence of the UN, they've circumvented the Security Council, or they've relied on their veto. The winners are given impunity. The losers are subject to accountability in a major war. It was true in World War I as well. And it's been consistently a feature of international society. So we have to understand that the UN was not empowered to impose accountability in situations where the permanent members of the Security Council had a strong interest. And this can be taken in the wrong way to say, well, international law doesn't matter because of the primacy of geopolitics. And that's, in my view, a severe misinterpretation. And what Mr. Heenan said was very relevant. The Israelis and Americans would not care so much about the issues of legitimacy and legality if they weren't somehow important. But we need to understand how that importance plays out in the international system. And it's not by compliance with international law as such. What it does do is create a political atmosphere that mobilizes pressures both within the UN and within international society more broadly. It's helpful, I think, to look at what happened with South Africa or the anti-colonial wars. They were all won by the side that won what I call the legitimacy war. They were not won by the side that had superior military capabilities. And so Israel is quite right politically and tactically to be very worried about delegitimation and the BDS campaign. And it was not accidental or trivial that in this recent Jerusalem declaration that Biden and Lapid signed on August 14th, that they did this took this unprecedented step of saying they do all in their power to prevent delegitimation and to firmly oppose the BDS campaign. And this, in effect, goes against the fundamental right of free expression in the democratic societies, which in the first paragraph of the Jerusalem Declaration, Israel and the US declare that they're unified by their respect for the values of democracy and the rule of law, actually. I mean, it's an incredibly hypocritical document that really should be read. So what I'm saying essentially is that there are two domains of political behavior that should be separated. One is the substantive domain in which the UN has been stymied by geopolitics and by a series of factors that have made it impossible to implement international law. And then there's the symbolic domain of politics in which legitimacy wars are resolved and decided. And in that legitimacy war, international law plays a huge part in reshaping the discourse in such a way as to mobilize solidarity initiatives within civil society and to activate those governmental forces that are free from geopolitical constraint. And that's what happened to South Africa. They didn't have a moral awakening one morning and decide that apartheid was wrong. They felt the pressure from a combination of civil society and the UN campaign, anti-apartheid campaign, and the successful mobilization of some governments to impose sanctions, and that led to a change of strategic judgment on the part of this white supremacist leadership that it would be better off with constitutional democracy and ethnic equality than it would be managing this racist regime that was being isolated and delegitimized in the world. So I think it's important to understand both that international law is incapable by itself of being implemented under current conditions, and that it's crucial to the struggle for liberation and self-determination that the Palestinians have waged so bravely for so long. Let me stop there.
Right, very, very interesting, very much to the point intervention, to be honest. You never cease to teach us. I have a question actually that came right in for you, Richard, about your last point, and that question is, which lessons should Palestinians learn from the South African experience as to not fall in the trap of post-apartheid, yet economic apartheid of Black South Africans?
That's a very difficult, important question, but in one sense it's premature because the priority, I think, for the Palestinian people at the moment is to end the apartheid regime. And that may involve certain kinds of compromises, which Nelson Mandela knowingly made and didn't achieve all that he hoped to achieve, but he did achieve the fundamental liberation of the African population in South Africa. And the post-apartheid struggles, that's a new phase in seeking to achieve a society that is just and fair and equitable, but it should not interfere, it seems to me, with concentrating energies at the present time in securing liberation and fundamental basic rights.
All right. I think our audience is seeing a future where Palestine would be, or Palestinians would have their freedom, trying to learn from these lessons from past colonial settings and not to fall in the same traps of let's say, whether it's South Africa or other countries, like countries in the Middle East, for instance, neighboring countries that have gained their independence and yet are still shackled by certain dominance.
Yeah, maybe I am too quickly. Of course, the experience of other countries should be studied and learned from, and the process of achieving a truly democratic society that is respectful of human rights, including economic and social rights, is a daunting challenge. And very few countries in the world have met that challenge successfully in the post-colonial world. At the same time, and maybe this repeats what I tried to say earlier, none of those countries would for a moment retreat to colonial status. In other words, the liberation a phase, and the post-liberation struggle is one that is of course intertwined with the problems of global domination by the United States and the hegemonic influences that Russia and China try to project beyond their borders. It's a tricky world for new states to navigate, and there is no shining model. Maybe one can look at a country like New Zealand having escaped. It's very geographically remote and isn't at the center of resource conflict or ideological conflict. But you find very few countries that have solved this challenge. Vietnam and China have done remarkably if you look only at economic and social rights. Their success in eliminating poverty for the lower 30 or 40% of their population is little short of remarkable and unprecedented in history, and gets no credit in the West, which focuses only on political rights, political and civil.
Sure, maybe that is a very valid point. Thank you, Richard. Actually, this is a question to Francesca. I'm trying to see the name. So this is the question. In light of the clear bias towards Israel, the political bias towards Israel, will it be useful to continue following the same mechanisms in dealing with Israeli violations? Is it possible to introduce other mechanisms that might be more effective to hold Israel accountable? Or are you following the same line as the previous persons that were in your position?
Frankly, I don't think that another mechanism is necessarily needed, especially now that there is a commission of inquiry. If we look at the human rights, the monitoring of respect, adherence with international law, I don't think that another mechanism is frankly needed. The Commission of Inquiry on Israel occupied Palestine, including the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, has a mandate which is broad geographically and temporally, meaning doesn't have limitations, is to look at the situation of the war in Gaza in 2021, but it is also to look at the root causes of the ongoing, perduring violence in Israel and occupied Palestine. And this is a huge mandate that can look also at where the violence, if we can call it violence, comes from, and so look at the origin of the question of Palestine. And it's important to look at what made Palestine an ongoing, enduring UN responsibility, a permanent responsibility of the UN by the very admission of the General Assembly because the UN took part in partitioning Palestine, decided to partition Palestine. At the time, the Arab Palestinians were the absolute majority in the country. So this commission has the possibility to look back in history and then also to look at crimes that are committed, violations of international law, including crimes. So look at preserving evidence that can lead to individual responsibility. So the mandate is huge, and this is why the commission of inquiry is so much under attack, because it's impressive what this body can do. So therefore, I don't think that another mechanism is necessary. What is needed is to bridge the hiatus, to bridge the divide between the legality, illegality, and political action / inaction. I mean, it's time for the international community to abide by its responsibilities and international law. Because again, I think that it's past the time that only Israel can be held responsible for the treatment of the Palestinians, as if it has ever been the case. So we need to make good use of the existing mechanism.
All right. In how do you call it? Focusing on something that you have mentioned, which is the attacks that the Commission of Inquiry has been going through. We received a question that is actually for all four of you. The question says, how do you deal with Israel's systematic refusal to cooperate with UN investigations and the escalating campaigns by politically motivated groups to discredit you personally and delegitimize the work of the UN groups as anti-Semitic in order to divert attention from the gross human rights violations taking place in Israel and Palestine? How do you personally deal with it as a UN body, or you as persons having to face these attacks of anti-Semitism and other forms of bullying or intimidation because of the work that you do? I'll start with Francesca.
Look, in the past years, there has been an escalation of the attacks against any critique of Israel under the label of anti-Semitism. There has been a real weaponization of anti-Semitism. And I say there has been an escalation because it has become more serious, more comprehensive, and more widespread. It has gone beyond the border of occupied Palestine and Israel. And Richard he is a living example of how fierce the attack against him have been for being simply a critical voice of Israeli policies and practices. So this is a malign tactic that has been used. It continues to be used to shelter Israel from criticism. But ultimately, no one is above the law in international community, and we need to walk that talk. No one is above the law, because what makes international law so compelling, it's universality, and the fact that it should apply to everyone in the same fashion. What I would like to point to, though, is the flip side of it. I mean, I noticed that there is quite a significant anti-Palestinian bias, and it's widespread, and it goes pretty much unnoticed. And there is a tendency to look at what's going on now with the organizations that have been designated as terrorists. Now it's clear of how much effort has been devoted to try to demonstrate, to try to investigate and see if these organizations were terrorists or not, fit the terrorism designation. But in fact, was it necessary, since Israel has never provided the inch of evidence that to support its claim? No, but there has been even a CIA report on it. So again, I do believe that this is part and parcel of a bias against the occupied people that is to be acknowledged, and it manifests, as I said, far beyond the borders, so to speak, of Israel-Palestine, and tackles all activists, all critical voices engaged on the front of justice and human rights in Israel-Palestine.
Right. Before I have still a few more questions, just a few minutes past time. But Ramzy, before we go to the next questions, I would like to direct this question to you too, as a Palestinian, as someone who is the victim of this occupier. How do you receive those attacks as being anti-Semitic? I assume you have received such attacks.
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, who hasn't? In fact, this is kind of the litmus test of knowing you are on the right track, is to be subjected to this kind of abuse. Anyone who speaks out against Israel, against its ideologically deformed Zionist movement, against the practices, the violent practices against the Palestinian people, or against any manifestation of Israeli occupation and apartheid, is considered anti-Semitic in the definition of Israel, and that will never change until the occupation and apartheid ends. But if you allow me, Haneen, regarding your previous question, which is related to this one as well, I think it's important that we keep in mind that no national liberation movement anywhere in the world would have succeeded in overthrowing the chains of oppression, colonialism, apartheid, and what have you, without the resistance of the indigenous population. You could, if South Africa just sat there and appealed to the rest of the world to take a moral stance and to stand or to condemn apartheid and so forth, I think apartheid in South Africa would be happening right now as we speak. I think Vietnam would still be an occupied country. I think Algeria would still be a settler colonial state that is evolving within the French influence and so forth and so on. So we cannot underestimate the resistance of the people. And really, I mean, considering everything that we have been discussing so far, these deep existing biases in Western politics, media, the failure of good people at the United Nations to overcome the numerous obstacles put forth by these establishments and these political institutions and these governments, yet here we are still talking about Palestine, still talking about Gaza, still talking about the Palestinian people as if it's a politically urgent subject. What made that happen if it were not for the resistance of the Palestinian people? The fact that they are the ones who are forcing us to engage with this struggle. If it were not for their resistance, there is nothing to talk about whatsoever. But aside from that, the courage of people like Richard, like James, like Francesca, like Michael Link, numerous others who are, still insisting on the legitimacy and the rights of the Palestinian people, and they are still fighting the good fight despite of the name calling, of the obstacles, of the marginalization that they suffer from, and the personal attack that they have to endure. We also have to keep in mind what Richard has mentioned earlier, the geopolitics. The geopolitics of the world is in constant change. Things never remain the same. If you look at the geopolitics that led to the liberation of many countries around the world, you will find that there are indeed circumstances that made South Africa a free country right now that goes beyond the borders of South Africa. And the same applies to so many different national liberation struggles. So my message to the Palestinians in particular, pay attention to the geopolitical changes around the world, this rising bipolarity or unipolarity that's happening as we speak. Try to exploit that, take advantage of that. Stop begging and pleading at the doors of the White House. The Americans ultimately will give you nothing, and they have made that position so very clear. But again, it is the resistance of the people that will ultimately make all the difference.
Thank you very much, Ramzy. It's very, very true. Never did a colonizer walk away out of the goodness of his heart. There has always been all forms of resistance. And I think Francesca mentioned that in the beginning of your speech when you talked about self-defense and how that is actually void in international law. I wish there was much more time. This is very interesting. We received a few questions. If you allow me a few more minutes, speakers, a lot of people are asking why. Let me summarize it in, if Ukraine, then why not Palestine? This is basically the sort of questions that have been coming in. So they're asking sports sanctions against Russia. Why are no sports sanctions? If we cannot do big things, those fall under some sort of international bodies. These could also be implemented when it comes to Palestine. There is a question from Rola for James that says, can you see similarities between Israel's violations in the occupied territories and Russia's acts in Ukraine? I know this is a big question that you cannot just cover in a few minutes, but many of the questions to James and Richard are within the Russian, and this is also tackles the point that Ramzy mentioned, that geopolitics are shifting, they are affecting the region. How do you see this? Let's not go in the specifics. We know why we have discussed why there are no sanctions against Israel. It needs the willingness of member states. So this point has been tackled. But do you, as a UN body and as people who work within the UN, take into consideration the geopolitical dimensions of Palestine within the Arab region and within the global movements when you submit policy reports, or do you really keep it very specific into that piece of territory? James, and then maybe Richard.
Okay, so briefly, I mean, my mandate, excuse me, only covers the occupied Palestinian territory. So I formally don't work on Ukraine, and I can't really comment on that. But but what I'm going to say is linked to that. No, we focus narrowly on what the law says, international law. If you move off the path of international law and my job, you'll get into all sorts of difficulties. We apply the same standards everywhere in the world, and we do the same in Palestine. I would say that, you know, for example, we had very strong recommendations from the UN Human Rights Committee on Israel this year in April, I think it was, where the Human Rights Committee was very clear that the blockade of Gaza amounts to collective punishment of the civilian population of Gaza. That was a step forward in the committee's jurisprudence, if I can use that word loosely. But it does show that the committee and my office will focus on the law. Absolutely, we won't get too distracted by the geopolitical narratives, because we know that that's really the whole problem. So we focus on the law. On the question before about personal attacks, we just continue to do our work. I don't really care. We'll just continue to do our mandate. If we're outside the country, we're outside other countries as well. We're outside Syria and we're outside North Korea, but we're still monitoring those countries. My colleagues in those other offices, Israel just joins that group. Over. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, James. Unfortunately, I have to bring this to an end, where I keep on hearing there were 6 minutes past time, despite the many questions that are coming in. I'd like also to say, just to end on James' notes, that we too, as a human rights organization and human rights group, we face the same sort of intimidation and bullying and defamation and all sorts of personal attacks that sometimes go because to our families as a form of threat and intimidation, only for speaking out against Israeli violation. What I always say is that the Israeli party, or the other party does not wish to understand, and they keep getting stuck in their own colonial tantrums, is that freedom for Palestinians is coming. So today, thank you. With you, we have discussed 8 decades of aggressive, inhumane Israeli settler colonial policies against Palestinians. In tandem, the story is also, as Ramzy pointed out, it is the stories of 8 decades of brave Palestinians standing up for their right to determine their own future. So every story has 2 sides. I thank you really wholeheartedly. I thank you very much for this talk. I think we've had also, I thank the audience that has been sitting on the edge, trying to listen and understand the usually very complicated mechanism of international law and the workings of the UN. I think you have been very gentle in also using layman term at times for the audience and for everyone that is watching you to understand better how work in Palestine, human rights work in Palestine functions. Thank you so much. I wish you all a good day and hopefully see you soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.